Hello and welcome. Today we have a nice rough pair of LX M569 shifters 3x8. I've already done a video on these, but I want to make an improvement as we at Boyd channel constantly like to modernize and improve our content. So these shifters are, let's be honest, quite ugly. Something I don't like about them, other than them being bulky, is here on the dial. So this is the 8-speed side. You can't actually see what speed you're on. Fair enough, but then what's the point of the dial? So I'm going to do a cleaner version of this. I'm going to work on the 3-speeded side today, and I'll do a part 2 on the 8-speed side. So let's begin on doing that. These are fairly annoying to work on. The cover here can be removed using a Phillips screw. I've already undone mine. Before you do anything else, make sure you remove all the tension on the internal spring by putting it onto the lower gear. Next, we're going to remove this bolt right here. Weirdly, they've put a Phillips head instead of a normal hex one. So let's undo that. Here we're going to have the first plate to lift up, and there'll be the return spring for this lever that was latched onto here. Here's a bushing. We can lift up that first lever. There's a nylon bushing here, and we can remove this. Right here there's a circlip to remove, so you're going to need something sharp to push it out. The spring. Underneath here there's a spring, so we're going to remove that. There's a bushing. Underneath that bushing there's a very thin washer. Before we work on it further, I think we need to remove this black cover. So there's a small screw which is just underneath here that I've removed, although mine was actually not really holding on because it was broken. And there's these to remove, and then we should be able to remove that completely. You can now pretty much just take all this off at the same time, and nothing underneath that. Right here there's a circlip to remove. Very small. We can now begin to lift up this plate. Let's remove that first pull. So it's been tensioned with a spring. I'm going to just gently lift that up. Take off that spring. Some sort of nylon or ceramic bushing. Nylon. And here's I guess it's a sprocket. Let's remove that cam. So you need to move this dial out the way to be able to lift it up. And there's a bushing that you can remove. If you want, you can remove this dial by removing that screw, and then just and there'll be a spring underneath it. This bolt, the pivoting part here in the middle, this can also be removed, but you need to take off the sticker with a sharp object if you really need to. So we're going to give everything a clean. I have grouped parts together, and I generally clean them in groups to keep them somewhat together. Makes it easier to reassemble, and then we'll put some grease on the parts that are need be. So I'll let you get on with that. Right, so I've cleaned everything up, and now I need to just grease up some of the parts, notably the pivots and any parts that have friction on them. So let's get onto that. I'll be using a Teflon grease on this particular shifter. So we're going to put the return spring onto the cam. There's a hole right here, at least for my right, and we're going to put the tip that's running through the center of this spring into the hole there. And now the other tip of that spring is going to go right here on this back plate. Take that nylon, take this bushing and run it through. And then we're going to put the cam installed on it. Now this part of the cam is going to be stopping right here eventually, so it will need to go down in this position. So I think the easiest thing will be to put the spring into that hole first. So I'm just going to put that in. Now you do need to push that back as well. So I've got something holding it. And on this side, you need to move this dial out the way so that you can lay this eventually flat. So that's now a little bit moved. And now we're going to go back to that return spring. And what we're going to try and do is get that spring to go to this part here. I'm going to put my finger on it just to keep it underneath the knife. And okay, it's latched on. I'm going to go back to the other side. Move that dial maybe out the way. You basically just want this to be laying nice and flat with that spring not overlapping on anything, because the spring is overlapping a little bit, so you need to move out of the way until this lays flat. Even though it undid itself, once it was towards here it was kind of staying in place, and now it's looking like it's laying flat. And you want that lever to kind of go into the cam right there, and so this should be returning the cam itself. You can now put this sprocket back on into the right teeth. You'll see on one side it's facing upwards towards us. On mine it's stamped F right there. Let's work on the next pull. So grab the spring. One tip's more inwards than the other. This one's much coming out a lot more. So that tip of that spring there is going to go, let's say, on this left hole at the back. Just push that down. And then after here, you have the ceramic-y part that runs through. And then finally, the pull itself. So we're going to be putting it into this position. So there's a tiny little hole there, and the other tip of that spring is going to run through it. So you need to aim for that, at the same time putting it into the pivoting part that's here. Now this was reclined back onto the between the two first teeth. So we need to tension that spring for it to be there. There you go. It's kind of laying level with the other sprocket. Now grab this plate. Now that little bit that's facing downwards is actually going to go in front of a pull, and you want to stick this part here going through the teeth of the pivot, and that other little hole there, the other little pivot's going to go through. So you need to move this out the way to go in front of that little bit there that's bent, acting like a stopper, I guess. There. and make sure it's laying flat because we're about to put a clip now. Make sure you shimmy that a little bit, this metal plate, until it really clicks down, and then you'll expose yourself to the slit that's just underneath here. So here's a tiny little circlip that we're going to click through. So here eventually we're going to put the first lever, so that part that's just sticking downwards is actually going to be seating like this, and it's going to be flicking right here, that pull. But before you put that, you need to have the covers ready. So there's also that little seal that's that needs to be put first as well. So I'm going to just do that. So you want the that lever to be aiming towards where I showed before, roughly. And on top of this, there's going to be another bushing with one of the gold colored washers. So that sits on the top of this. And it needs to be seated into the lever. Don't forget one of the screen that goes here before you put anything down, and we can then put the screw down here once you've seated this dial cover screen. Once you've seated all this down and made sure that this bushing's flat down, you can now grab this return spring. So the hook part is going to latch onto here, and then the other tip of that spring is going to fall into the hole on the lever itself. We're going to now install the next lever, so we need to prepare the pull for it. Grab the spring. The shorter side is going to go into the hole right there, so we're going to put that first. Then grab the pull, so the dots are facing upwards towards the camera. Push that down. On the other side of the lever, you have this nylon bushing to insert. You can now recline this back slightly when you're going to be putting this, but it's essentially going down into here, the part into this spacing, the pull. And then here you have another bushing that we want to push down onto until it fits nice and flat. And finally, the return spring. So you have one part facing down on the outer. It's going to hook up right here in the corner, and the other tip of that spring is eventually going to go into the hole of this plate right here. Position, once you've got that ready, position this plate roughly here on the lever. Now you want to catch that other tip of that spring and essentially bring it underneath until it gets to that, to the hole. Okay, got that on. Now make sure that the spring is not overlapping underneath. Finally, you can take the bolt while holding all this down, because it can fall off quite easily, and start to screw down. Okay, so make sure you tighten that quite nicely. You can use some thread lock on it if you want. I'm not going to bother with mine. We can now put these the plastic pod cover back on. If you look closely on the other side of the pod cover, by the way, there's a I better show that. There's this little part here that actually goes into the hole on this metal part, of the lever. You just need to move the spring out of the way. Screw that down. Screw down the last little bits and bobs that I took out from before. And that should be working for you. So thank you for listening. Stay tuned for part 2 of the 8-speed side. Thank you for listening, and until next time, peace out.